Good morning and welcome to the Inclusive Teaching webinar. My name is Danica Saunders. I'm the event coordinator for SACAP and I will be your host this morning. Joining us this morning, we have two amazing speakers, both ready to share their knowledge on inclusive education and how we can work inclusivity and social emotional learning into our classrooms. First up, we have Cina Mosito, who is an Associate Professor of Inclusive Education at Nelson Mandela University and is a PhD graduate from the University of Cape Town. Her research, teaching, postgraduate supervision, and community engagement all concern understanding and supporting child development and learning in challenging circumstances, mainstreaming inclusive education in initial teacher education, and continuing professional development of teachers. She is currently leading the rollout of Teaching for All program in the Eastern Cape. Then we have Charlene Wessels, who is an educational psychologist registered with the HPCSA and an educator at SACAP. She holds a master's degree in educational psychology, which she obtained from the University of Johannesburg, cum laude. She also has obtained her honors in social guidance and counseling, cum laude, postgraduate certificate in education, PGCE, and a bachelor in arts in drama and psychology. Charlene has a private practice in Durbanville, Cape Town, and she enjoys working with children, adolescents, and adults, guiding and assisting them on their path to emotional, social, and behavioral wellness. She also enjoys working with families, providing parental guidance, and so much more. Now, with any further ado, I will hand over to Professor Cina. Thank you.
Thank you, Danica, and good morning, everyone. Thank you. I've already been introduced, so I won't really say that much about myself. Those are the talking points that will inform the presentation. So, and I need to make it clear that I speak from a position of a teacher educator. So most of the ideas that I'll be sharing are things that I would share with student teachers as well as teachers who are in CPT programs. So thank you. So really, I'll chat the background and context of inclusive education in South Africa. And from that, I'll indicate lessons for practice. And then within those lessons for practice, I'll situate learners as far as what the key considerations are for teaching. And then I'll go into social emotional learning and what implications there are for practice as far as that is concerned, and how all this informs what I could call purposeful conversations in the context of cultural inclusivity and sensitivity. Really, I think I've already made it very clear that even though, that's really the overall thing, the main talk is around the 2 points: what social emotional learning is and how we can have purposeful conversations in the context of cultural inclusivity and sensitivity. Right. So if we talk about inclusive education in South Africa, I think it's very important to understand that there's a particular stance that we need to take. And this has been informed by research that has been conducted by quite a number of people. The most recent one being the report by Majoko Pasha and others, which indicates the context as far as exclusions and understanding of what inclusive education is. If I could share from that alone, the report indicated that when you talk about inclusive education in South Africa, whether you are talking to a teacher educator, you are talking to parents, and sometimes you're talking to student teachers, people seem to have, different ways in which they understand what inclusive education is. And this becomes problematic as far as practice is concerned, because if we don't speak from the same script in terms of what a shared understanding of what inclusion and inclusive education is within the context of South Africa, it means we might be speaking against each other, acting against each other instead of working together. So the report makes it very clear that first, we need to have a shared understanding of what inclusion and inclusive education is, and especially when it comes to the young people and learners in South Africa. So one of the questions that were posed that actually underpinned that research was, when you talk about inclusion and inclusive education in South Africa, which learners and young people are we talking about? Some of the responses were things like, we are talking about learners who have been diagnosed with, learning disabilities. We're talking about learners who are staying at home. But then overall, we need to understand that inclusive education is not about one kind of special learner, it's about all the learners. And therefore, in thinking about inclusive education as something that actually says we have to think about ways in which we teach all the learners, regardless of the language that they speak, regardless of the cultures that they come from, but understanding that as a teacher, you'll be dealing with all these learners. So therefore, what are the things that you need to be, aware of? Some of the unintended exclusionary practices, for example, that might occur within the classroom space. And most importantly, what crucial knowledge should stakeholders, maybe talking about teachers in this regard, should have, the skills that they should have, and these positions that they should have, which are actually going to enable what you call inclusive education and inclusive teaching and inclusion within classrooms in South Africa. So talking about some of those lessons from research, the research indicated that it's a combination of factors that actually enable inclusion. It's about what people know. But we know that knowledge by itself is not sufficient, because knowledge is something that's actually lodged in the head. And of course, what else do we need to make sure that inclusion happens? And of course, we also have to know the kind of actions that we have to conduct out there in the space where inclusion has to happen. For example, when you talk about inclusive, pedagogy, what are we talking about? But most importantly, not that is the most important of all, but these are actually a set of, attributes. It's also the beliefs that you hold about learners who are different, whether they are different because of the languages that they speak, whether they're different because of their religion or sexual orientation and the like. So all this come together. I might know a lot about what good inclusive teaching is. I might claim I'm doing it, but if my attitudes themselves, present a set of what you could call attitudinal barriers to learning, that becomes a problem. So there's a need for anyone who's in the space of inclusive education to really think about what knowledge set are they bringing, what beliefs are they bringing into the table, and what are they doing about it all? Right. So with that set of factors, which is knowledge, skills, as well as beliefs, factors, then we have to think about the learners in classrooms and what the key considerations for teaching are. And so one of the questions would be that we know that learners, it's really a fact, whose success or lack of success, it finds expression in the context that they find themselves. That's a fact. That it's not so much because learners cannot do, but we want to promote a thinking about the context being actually one decisive factor that enables or disables learning. So one of the questions that you have to ask is, which is a fact, what is the developmentally possible for all learners? We can talk about quite a number of developmental attributes. For example, cognitive and intellectual attributes, gross and fine motor skills, as well as speech and language. And all this, including social emotional, attributes, all these are actually, what you could call developmental possibilities. And the argument that is being made in the space of inclusive education at the moment is that learners who we might call as highly intellectual, who might have a very good set of gross and fine motor skills, when they find themselves within a school context or a curriculum that does not support all this, that is actually going to be a problem. So let's suppose that we have a learner that has been diagnosed with speech and language, problems or challenges. One of the key questions to educators has to be, what is amenable to educational intervention, and how, towards promoting inclusive education and quality for all, should a teacher be doing? Understandably, this is a necessary question because we do not want to find a space whereby teachers are thinking they have to be doing what a psychologist or an occupational therapist is doing. So it's important for a teacher to understand that which they have to do when a learner has been diagnosed with any of these challenges or barriers to learning. What is the educational response, if I could put it that way? So one of the key talking points that I've been asked to speak about is that of social emotional learning. And I think this is an important point because when we think about teaching, we think about the subjects that we teach. But then equally important is for us to think about the learners that come into the classroom. What is that enables them to learn? And hence the issue of social emotional learning. So social emotional learning speaks to that which the emotional intelligence and emotional literacy that are fundamental social and emotional skills and competencies that enable learners to learn in classrooms. And one of the questions that I want to pose is, to what extent does our curriculum actually engage with this? I know that in the South African, school curriculum, we have subjects life skills and life orientation. And what has come across through research, and I think it's something that many of us can resonate with, is that very often people who teach life skills and life orientation, maybe especially life orientation, there's a strong voice in research that says it's not necessarily teachers who have been trained to teach life skills or life orientation, especially at a high school context. Therefore, the question would be, if that being the case, how much of emotional awareness are they actually bringing into the curriculum of life orientation? So I'm not putting the blame, but I'm just saying these are things that you have to be thinking of. And then, and of course, to what extent are they actually helping the learners to develop the capacity to express and manage their emotions appropriately, and making responsible decisions and choices, which will establish positive and positive social relationships, and which will also help them to handle difficult interpersonal, situations effectively. So if all these things are not in place, the question is, what kind of learners are we really going to get across the school curriculum? Because within life orientation, which some people actually have a very low opinion of, because I've been in discussions where people want to know, why are we teaching life orientation when it doesn't even get considered at high school? But I think it's important for us to understand the space of that life orientation, if it's handled correctly or appropriately in relation to what it gears towards doing as far as the social, emotional health of the learners is concerned. And so it's really principled on the understanding that, without all these skills that I've just highlighted here, children will remain vulnerable to many emotional and psychological problems. And therefore, all of us in the context of education, multi-stakeholders, if I may call us, we need to really think about the approaches that will strengthen the children so that, or the learners, children learners is the same thing from where I stand, so that they can navigate all the difficult spaces that they'll find themselves in. And therefore, our curriculum has to be very holistic so that it supports the development of all the other sets of developments that are pointed towards, as well as the social, emotional skills and competences of the learners across the schooling career, even up to university. And that means, in effect, you should have a dedicated and knowledgeable teaching staff who really know what social emotional learning is all about. And I think that's a challenge for us in teacher education. And it's also a challenge for all people who are in education to really think about the extent to which, we deal with issues of social emotional learning in the curriculum. When you know that, even the most brilliant of learners, if they are not supported socially and emotionally, that could actually be a precursor to what we might call barriers to learning and even vulnerability to failure. So the question that we really need to be asking is, what knowledge, skills, and dispositions do we have as educators at all levels about diverse learners and children? And then what bearing should such knowledge and skills and dispositions have on initial teacher education, as well as continuing professional development of teachers? And I would argue that that actually requires of us to conduct what we call, courageous and purposeful, discussions around, some of these issues. And the question will be, as I have said, what should drive, what knowledge within teacher education programs and CPD should drive content on social and emotional learning, and how then should we be preparing teachers for the world of diversity, as it were. You can move on to the next slide. Some of the research that I have conducted shows that for us to have what are called purposeful conversations around, social and emotional learning, one of the knowledges that you should have is the knowledge around cultural diversity and sensitivity. And so there are many, talks around there in terms of how these can be happen. But before we go that, what really makes this so important is because we know that education is regarded as an equalizer at all fronts, that when all people, members of a society, are equally educated, then that has the power to extend beyond the development of skills we need for economic success, as education has also been seen to really contribute to nation building and reconciliation. And equally important, schools are called nodes of care and support. And so they have the potential to serve as gateways for a range of services for children and learners. So the question is, what exactly are we doing? How can we do that to ensure that we equalize through education and schools actually become those nodes of care and support? One of the reasons why it becomes so important, South Africa is a country of many cultural dilemmas and controversies. Recently, sorry, that is supposed to be 2022, not 2002. The South African Human Rights Commission was conducting, some investigations in the Eastern Cape around the dilemma of school uniform and regulation of appearance. And there are all kinds of reasons why children should look the same as far, as uniform and regulation in terms of, hairstyles and the like is concerned. But we know that on the other side, that has really caused a lot of controversies. Think of some of I think it's Pretoria Girls High School, as well as Sansusi Girls here in Cape Town. Some of the protests that were conducted, all in the name of, hairstyles, how through those hairstyles, it seems that, people are being made to look the same in contradiction to what they feel could be their right to expressing their identity. And of course, that issue of uniformity in schools and regulation as appearance, as we have seen, has actually created a lot of discomforts around multiple expressions of being. For example, gender, sexual, orientation, religion, class, etc., whereby it's like, the context in which education takes place, it seems to drive the discourse that children do not fit in as they should, and therefore they have to be made to look a particular way and express themselves in a certain way. And of course, there'll always be voices around, a voice that says it's okay for children to look exactly the same in terms of how they carry their hair, how they wear their hair, the uniform that they carry. But then one of the questions that you should really be thinking about, if we talk about, creating conversations around inclusivity, is a question of how does this create discomfort amongst others? And how does that, in effect, seem to be pushing the discourse of discrimination and biases? And one of the issues that is actually troubling us in inclusive education is the issue of the absence of relevant concepts in indigenous knowledges, all the indigenous knowledges, to enable or carry the conversation on cultural diversity language. I can share one of those. In one of my lectures at Nelson Mandela University, where we hold what we call courageous conversations, I was talking about issues of sexual orientation. And we have all those languages, the gay, the LGBTQI, etc. So one of my students asked me, so how do I say this in isiXhosa, for example, or in Sesotho or isiZulu, in as much comfort as you seem to be enjoying? And he brought it to my attention that I'm speaking from the position of privilege, which actually woke me up from whatever slumber I was in, because I had thought, now that we have talked about it within teacher education space during lectures, it's going to be easy for my students to talk about this. But he pointed out that it's not just about talking about it, it's also about understanding the culture within which these discussions and conversations has to be carried out. And that maybe as a young person who goes back to my community to try to talk about this in exactly the same way you are, do I have the language that actually enables me to do that? So, and some of the theories or the people who have been conducting research in this space talk about some of the models that we can use in really addressing this, maybe within a school context, wherever. For example, one of those that I like is the cultural iceberg theory by Hall, who says at any given time when you talk about culture, we have to remember that there are two things that are at place here. It's either you're talking about the surface culture or the deep culture. And the surface culture is always very easy to talk about. Things that include the surface culture could be, language, how we dress, etc., the holidays and the festivals. But he says underpinning all those, it's that which is a lot more complex to talk about, and we don't always talk about it. But within spaces of education, we really have to create, moments for discussion around that. That is the deep culture, because it's not visible. But then through reflections and discussions that we might have, we actually make it more visible. For example, the beauty ideals. I know that very often people come hard on Black African learners or Black African women who like their weaves. And because it's just a simple thing of saying, why are you not proud of your culture, etc. But the more, I think it's necessary for us to really try to go deeper in terms of understanding why people would want to look a particular way. Does it necessarily mean that they negate that which they are, or they're not comfortable with that which they are? So issues that we see, what we see outside is not just enough for us to attribute our own initial interpretations of what we see without really understanding the reasons behind one's own beauty ideals, if that is the thing. Because within that, there are issues of self-concept that you have to deal with. There are issues of relation to authority, issues of child rearing practices that you need to be thinking about, the work ethic, for example. If we talk about the work ethic in relation to issues of how we look, we know that for a very long time, people were in dreadlocks like me might not have been allowed to go into the office space with those dreadlocks, because they are not seen to be ethically okay for the workspace. And therefore, this is one of the things that could actually be aiding people to be going into a particular ideal of beauty, etc. So I think, in short, what really Paul is saying here is we should not just focus so much on the outside things, but it's always necessary for us to scratch the surface, to go below that, to understand the biases that are contained in some of this that we see, the core values that people hold, and most importantly, where all this come from, because it's always difficult to see those. But through conversations, we get to understand all this, and therefore we do not project our own biases and discriminations in terms of how people conduct themselves. So another important lesson is from UNESCO's intercultural, competence. And on intercultural competence, what UNESCO says actually is the fact that equally, just because one has, access to a language of, for example, I speak English, it's not my first language, but it does not necessarily mean that I have access to the culture as well. And therefore, there's always a need for me to really dig deeper in terms of the knowledge that I have. I think social linguists would capture it better here in terms of saying that there's also the pragmatic side of that which we call language, which is just about understanding language within the context, the cultural context in which it occurs. So language is not just about what we speak, it's also about understanding the values and the beliefs of the people who use that language. And not only English, I must say, all the languages. So once again, you have to create openness to dialogue and respect, so that we deal with all those attitudes that you have about the other, and all those add to our respect to human rights, because human rights are very important. It also adds to our respect to cultural diversity. And of course, that intercultural dialogue itself is a whole lot of things, as we have seen. So the two diagrams, the figures, the one from Hall and the one from UNESCO, the intercultural competence tree, really speak to each other in so many ways. So when we want to create that space for conversations around cultural sensitivity and inclusivity, dialogue is very important, so that we do not end up to finding ourselves othering the other, or promoting the same isms that we seek to really get rid of within the context that we find ourselves. And most importantly is to remember that being proficient in a foreign language does not necessarily mean that we are interculturally competent. So there's a lot more that you need to understand. And a language is not just language as we speak it. Language, think about language as a form of text. The clothes that we wear is a form of language. How we carry ourselves is a form of language. and a need for us to understand why people do certain things, instead of maybe putting labels like, as an example, Sotho people are like this, Xhosa people are like that. It doesn't really help us, especially when you speak from outside. So I think all in all, it means that there's a need for us to self-interrogate as people who are in the space of education. The self-interrogation will really involve us asking ourselves what could be the source of our beliefs and assumptions about the people that we interact with. And if, for example, I believe that certain kinds of learners do not have it in them to do mathematics, one of the things that I need to really ask is, what is the source of that belief? Why would I think a learner cannot do mathematics? Why do I think a certain learner or group of learners cannot play rugby or soccer, whatever the case might be? So as somebody who wants to carry I don't know whether I could call it a slogan or I could call it, a title of an inclusive teacher, there is a need to continually really ask yourself about what beliefs you hold about others and what the source of those beliefs are and the assumptions. And one other thing that you need to remember is when things happen within the spaces where we work and we do nothing about it, we go silent. Inaction and silence themselves are very powerful actions. It's a conscious choice to maintain a status quo. I'll share something that I experienced many years ago. I was in a classroom doing research at a school here in Cape Town, and it was in the early 90s, if I recall. And the one boy was trying to answer a question, and a whole set of boys rained down on me, you Murphy, you Murphy. And I didn't know what Murphy was, honestly, at that time, in terms of that language of calling people Murphy. But I could read the boys' discomfort, extreme discomfort. And what really bothered me was the fact that the teacher did nothing about it. So I went back to campus and I asked, look, this is what happened. What is Murphy? Because this is what happened. The boy was trying to answer a question and others rained on him. And so we discussed the whole issue about how the teacher reacted in this. And that teacher made a very powerful statement by simply being silent, by simply being inactive to say that I agree with you. This boy deserves to be treated the way you are treating him. So I think it's also important to think about those inactions and silences that we seem to allow in classrooms as educators. Whether you are an educator at school, you are an educator in the community, or an educator within the context of university or wherever we find ourselves, inaction and silence are powerful actions by themselves. So in terms of now the way forward, in closing this discussion, I would say it's important for us to always think about those unexamined or what I could call subtle or implicit biases around any of those, the language of description, which implies those biases. In what ways do I seem to be promoting the isms and the phobias? And those, unfortunately, are always in our subconscious. We don't even see them. But like I've said, by not saying anything, we're including it. We're actually promoting those isms and the phobias. And sometimes we think we are protecting the other by saying, no, shame, I don't think this person can fit in here. By doing that unintentionally as well, you are promoting the isms. Why would you go the I shame to somebody who is within the space where you are by thinking that they cannot fit in, they cannot do what you expect of them? And I think most importantly, with our awareness of all this, that there is always the space for that unexamined, subtle, and implicit bias, then we always have to be willing to learn and engage because there is so much more. So I would have loved to say a lot more about this, but I know that we are under timing, Danica, and I'm not the only speaker today. So in short, that's what I'll leave you with, that let's think about those biases that we carry. So if you really want to read more about some of the ideas that I brought here, I've also provided a set of references. I'm part of a project called Teaching for All in South Africa. At the moment, we are doing a continuing professional development of teachers, in the Eastern Cape, as part of really bringing into the space of teaching, especially for teachers who graduated a long time ago, some of the ideas that I'm talking about here, about the knowledge that you bring and the beliefs that you bring into the space of education and how we can act. I know I haven't really touched that much on inclusive pedagogy. My talk has really been more on the kind of things that we should be thinking about. So when you receive the slides, which I've been told you'll receive, you'll also see some of those references that I've used here, and you might want to read them and really get a sense of what these people talk about in relation to the issues that I've raised. Thank you very much. I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Prof. Cina, for all that invaluable information. Just to say again, I'm Charlene Wessels, I'm an educational psychologist, and my talk today is really going to be on how to. I think we've got so much knowledge in terms of what inclusive education is, but how do we implement it in our classrooms? How do we make a difference? And how can you make a difference as teachers? So basically, social and emotional learning really is a skill that we give kids. We want them to be able to cope with feelings. We want them to be able to set goals. We want them to have interpersonal skills so that they can resolve conflicts, so that they can work in a team, so that they don't discriminate against each other, so that they learn and think differently, so that they can build their self-esteem. So if we think about social and emotional learning in general, the purpose of it is to improve behavior, to cultivate empathy within children, to help them have a sense of compassion so that they don't go on the playground, they don't say mean things to kids, they don't bully other children, but they realize what they are doing in terms of actions is important. It's also just to give them that ability to build positive relationships. I mean, that is a life skill. It helps improve self-confidence, it helps to improve their decision-making for the future. So social and emotional learning has got a big, big, big part in the curriculum. And I think the question is exactly that. It's not good enough for us as teachers and schools to only focus on social and emotional learning within the life skills classroom. We actually need to do it in every single lesson. We actually need to do it at the start of the day, throughout the day. And I think the biggest thing is when the question comes, but how do we do it without not having it impact the curriculum? Because maybe you're scared that you're not going to get through all the work. There are ways, even if it is just a minute or 2 minutes before the lesson starts, we can already make a difference in terms of using social and emotional learning in our classes. And I'm very excited to share some ideas with you today. What you're going to have a look at now is we're going to quickly look at a video. And this video is called A Single Story. The purpose of me showing you this video is for you to realize that we need to be careful with the perception that we look at things. We need to be careful that we don't only have a single story of a situation. Let's have a look at the video.
I'm a storyteller, and I would like to tell you a few personal stories about what I like to call the danger of the single story. I grew up on a university campus in eastern Nigeria. My mother says that I started reading at the age of 2, although I think 4 is probably close to the truth. So I was an early reader, and what I read were British and American children's books. I was also an early writer. And when I began to write at about the age of 7, stories in pencil with crayon illustrations that my poor mother was obligated to read, I wrote exactly the kinds of stories I was reading. All my characters were white and blue-eyed. They played in the snow. They ate apples. And they talked a lot about the weather, how lovely it was that the sun had come out. Now, this despite the fact that I lived in Nigeria. I had never been outside Nigeria. We didn't have snow. We ate mangoes. And we never talked about the weather because there was no need to. My characters also drank a lot of ginger beer because the characters in the British books I read drank ginger beer. Never mind that I had no idea what ginger beer was. And for many years afterwards, I would have a desperate desire to taste ginger beer. But that is another story. What this demonstrates, I think, is how impressionable and vulnerable we are in the face of a story, particularly as children. Because all I had read were books in which characters were foreign, I had become convinced that books, by their very nature, had to have foreigners in them and had to be about things with which I could not personally identify. Now, things changed when I discovered African books. There weren't many of them available, and they weren't quite as easy to find as the foreign books, but because of writers like Chinua Achebe and Kamara Laye, I went through a mental shift in my perception of literature. I realized that people like me, girls with skin the color of chocolate, whose kinky hair could not form ponytails, could also exist in literature. I started to write about things I recognized. Now, I loved those American and British books I read. They stirred my imagination. They opened up new worlds for me. But the unintended consequence was that I did not know that people like me could exist in literature. So what the discovery of African writers did for me was this. It saved me from having a single story of what books are. I come from a conventional middle-class Nigerian family. My father was a professor. My mother was an administrator. And so we had, as was the norm, live-in domestic help who would often come from nearby rural villages. So the year I turned 8, we got a new houseboy. His name was Fide. The only thing my mother told us about him was that his family was very poor. My mother sent yams and rice and our old clothes to his family. And when I didn't finish my dinner, my mother would say, "Finish your food. Don't you know people like Fide's family have nothing?" So I felt enormous pity for Fide's family. Then one Saturday, we went to his village to visit. And his mother showed us a beautifully patterned basket made of dyed raffia that his brother had made. I was startled. It had not occurred to me that anybody in his family could actually make something. All I had heard about them was how poor they were, so that it had become impossible for me to see them as anything else but poor. Their poverty was my single story of them. Years later, I thought about this when I left Nigeria to go to university in the United States. I was 19. My American roommate was shocked by me. She asked where I had learned to speak English so well and was confused when I said that Nigeria happened to have English as its official language. She asked if she could listen to what she called my tribal music and was consequently very disappointed when I produced my tape of Mariah Carey. She assumed that I did not know how to use a stove. What struck me was this. She had felt sorry for me even before she saw me. Her default position toward me, as an African, was a kind of patronizing, well-meaning pity. My roommate had a single story of Africa, a single story of catastrophe. In this single story, there was no possibility of Africans being similar to her in any way, no possibility of feelings more complex than pity, no possibility of a connection as human equals. I must say that before I went to the US, I didn't consciously identify as African. But in the US, whenever Africa came up, people turned to me, never mind that I knew nothing about places like Namibia. But I did come to embrace this new identity, and in many ways, I think of myself now as African, although I still get quite irritable when Africa is referred to as a country, the most recent example being my otherwise wonderful flight from Lagos 2 days ago, in which there was an announcement on the Virgin flight about their charity walk in India, Africa, and other countries. So after I had spent some years in the US as an African, I began to understand my roommate's response to me. If I had not grown up in Nigeria, and if all I knew about Africa were from popular images, I too would think that Africa was a place of beautiful landscapes, beautiful animals, and incomprehensible people fighting senseless wars, dying of poverty and AIDS, unable to speak for themselves, and waiting to be saved by a kind white foreigner. I would see Africans in the same way that I, as a child, had seen Fide's family. This single story of Africa ultimately comes, I think, from Western literature. Now, here's a quote from the writing of a London merchant called John Locke, who sailed to West Africa in 1561 and kept a fascinating account of his voyage. After referring to the Black Africans as beasts who have no houses, he writes,
okay, so that was just a single story. I really would encourage you to go and have a look at the video. The video is quite long. I just wanted to bring across to you that it's so dangerous for us to have a single story. When kids come into our classes, it's so important to remember that maybe they went through something on the way to school. Maybe something happened in their house. Maybe mom and dad had a fight. Maybe something happened while they were trying to travel. Maybe they struggled to get to school. Maybe something happened yesterday. So dangerous if we only have a single story. So what's important in terms of inclusive education is to remember that we have to use a specific language. We need to remember that every single person in our classrooms are different. We need to be aware of that. We need to make sure that we are there to listen to them, giving them the opportunity to also speak. I think that's very, very important. And I just have a few things that I want you to think about as a teacher. Think about your own values and your approach to disability, gender, race. Does how you teach acknowledge the experiences of the students from different backgrounds? Do you teach in a way that includes all of them? Is your approach non-stereotypical? Do you encourage alternative perspectives, debate ideas, create an environment which is open to different viewpoints? Do you listen? Do you share those experiences in your classroom? Are your students treated as individuals, encouraged to share their own lives and interests? Yes, you are speaking about topics, you're speaking about the curriculum, but do you also give them the opportunity to share what's happening at home, even if it is just for a minute at the start of a lesson? So you can just take a minute to just think about these questions. I think it's very important that we think just how we teach. So I think the biggest thing in the bottom line is, how do we make our classrooms more inclusive? How can we make sure that it is inclusive? We need to create a supportive and respectful environment. We need to promote diversity and fairness. And we need to make sure that the expectations we have for our students are high. Research actually shows that students respond better when they feel that their teacher has faith in their abilities. I can't tell you how many examples I've had of kids that have come to me where teacher has had such a big impact in their lives by just saying something like, oh, you can't do it, or you can't do maths, or you are unable to do this, or just something as simple as reading out the child's mark in class. That can also have an impact on a child's self-esteem, and that's what they remember. They remember the judgment that their peers gave them when they received that. Creates a supportive peer culture, both inside and outside the classroom. It's important to not just focus on what's happening inside the classroom, but what is happening outside. If you know someone is struggling with friendships, be there to build a friendship circle around them. Group them up with people, group them up with kids that you think might be a friend, so that we don't have the children sitting alone at break, so that we don't have the children that's hiding in the bathroom at break time. Plan learning, which includes participation from everyone. So remember, when you are developing your lesson plans and all of that, it's so important to encourage group work. It's so important to have them have those sharing experiences, because that is the only way that they will be successful with regards to relationships, with regards to building that supportive network. Take a community approach to teaching and learning. The more we think about the communities and the differences we have and how we can encourage speaking about them, the better the environment will be, the more confidence kids will have, the more empathy they will be able to build. So the question here is, do you ever have trouble setting goals or making decisions? I do. I sometimes have trouble to set goals. What about coping with emotions? I think there's a lot of you here, I'm sure there's some of you here that are struggling with some emotions. Things are happening in your life. Maybe you've experienced a trauma. Maybe you are sad about something. Maybe you're happy. Or getting along with and feeling empathy for others. Sometimes it is hard to put ourselves in other shoes. And now we expect kids to do that. We expect them to just have these skills. They must just have it. we have to teach them, we have to give it to them. And the only way that we can do that is through social and emotional learning. So all of these are important social emotional learning skills. We need to give them the time to express their emotions. We need to offer them the opportunities. And I really hope with the next few ideas that I give you that you're really going to be able to incorporate more of that. I'm only giving you a few. There are so many ways that we can incorporate social emotional learning more in the classroom. Let's quickly have a look at some strategies. So some of the things you may already be doing that is part of the curriculum is active listening. We know that with all of our activities that we do, one of the things that is there and that is expected of us as teachers is active listening. We need to encourage them to listen to each other. Also think to just foster that collaboration, to allow them space to give them their answers so that they can actively listen to each other is very important. Other way is reflective thinking. Let them reflect. When something happens, let them reflect about their emotions. What are they thinking? How did they behave? Did they behave appropriately in the situation? Did they not? If you see someone in the class and they are saying something mean to the boy sitting next to them, let them think about what they are doing. Let them reflect. But not just that, let them reflect about things that's happening at home. Other thing is obviously questioning techniques. So we all know that asking open-ended questions is usually very good, because if you ask an open-ended question in the class, you're allowing the learners to actually have time to give more information and letting them express what they're feeling. So I think that's very, very important. And then having collaborative discussions. Remember, it's important that we allow them to share their thoughts, their opinions, their perspectives, just like that video that I just showed you. It is important that people and learners and students do not only see one perspective. They need to learn that there are a lot of differences. Things happen to people. They need to learn that if they say something mean to someone, for example, what is that boy going through in his life? What is happening with that person at that moment? Every morning is not going to be the same. As you know, if you drive to work or you're on your way to something, you could have been in an accident or you could have bumped a car, you could have been distressed. And if someone doesn't ask, how do you feel? What happened on your way here? Then how are we going to foster empathy? How are we going to build those relationships? How are we going to help kids build their confidence? So these are some of the strategies maybe you are already doing in the classroom. I want to share just on the next slide, things that you need to do in terms of starting the day. Before you even start school, before you even start your curriculum, ask them, what did you see? What did you see on your way to school? How did it make you feel? That's all. One question, 1 minute. You can let them write it down. You can let them, if some of them want to stand up, they want to speak about it, let them. Give them the opportunity to tell you about their day. How do you feel today? Do you see this chart here? It's very, very good for little kids, but even teenagers. If you have a chart like this in your class, you can even just as they come into the class, let them point. It will just give you an idea. Okay, this child is feeling sleepy. This child is feeling happy. This child is shocked. This child is tired. Then you'll know how to treat them during the lesson. You'll know how to structure the way that you are going to have the class. If you know that someone is in the class and they are sad, you'll know, maybe don't ask them questions directly because they're not going to be up for it today. Just gives you an idea also of what is happening in your class and just getting a feel for the kids that you are working with on that day. So this is something simple. It won't even take 5 minutes. You just let them point, you get an idea, this is how they're feeling. Later on, if maybe there's a specific child that, you can see is sad or traumatized or something happened, you can pull them aside, chat to them, show them that you care. That also will enhance their empathy level and the positive relationships that they have with you as a teacher. On the next slide, I've got some other ideas as well. The one is visualization. I think this is so important. So something that you can do, again, it works for all ages, is someone does say that they're angry, for example, is to have just a visual image somewhere in the class, where they just can show you, okay, but how angry are they? Are they calm, frustrated? Are they furious? Maybe something happened. And you can do this with all of the emotions. It just helps them with their emotional awareness, what they are feeling, and then also how to deal with it. Then other things that you can also do is visualization in terms of creating a vision board with it. So at the beginning of the year or the beginning of the term, you can actually help them to share what their vision is of the term. What are their goals? What do they want to achieve? That also helps them be positive about school, be positive about their relationships, having something to work for. That's very important in terms of visualization, just what they want to achieve. The next thing they're summarizing is when a student or a child does say something, it's very important to summarize what they are saying to you. They need to also learn to do that because that shows that they're listening, they're taking in what is being said, and then also just making them have those purposeful conversations. Storytelling. Let them tell stories. Let them go around. Tell me your story of today. What happened this morning? What happened this weekend? Is there something that you'd like to share with the class? We're just going to take 10 minutes of today's lesson. Or what is it that you can share? It's going to build relationships. It's going to also let them hear each other's perspective so that they know when they get on the playground, I'm not going to be mean to that child because actually, you know what? He's been going through a tough time. And they wouldn't have known if they didn't hear each other's stories. Also, in terms of getting to know them, it's also get to know you. It's important. Mindfulness, there's lots of different mindfulness techniques. They do say that mindfulness is very good because it lowers anxiety, gives self-control to students, it boosts positivity. And the other thing also is it actually increases body image, which is so powerful because I think a lot of teenagers and also kids really struggle with body image these days, especially with regards to social media and everything that they're seeing across social media. It's such a big thing. So with regards to mindfulness, some of the things you can do also at the start of a lesson, at the start of a school day, is really just let the kids breathe. Do an activity with them where they breathe, where they just breathe in for 5 seconds, they hold it for 4 seconds, they breathe out. They need to be aware of their surroundings. Let them think about what is it that they're feeling right now? How do they want to feel? What can help them get out of the state that they are in? If we can just let them breathe, it's already going to make a difference. That's one thing. The other thing that some people do is just, if you can, take one of the students for a walk or tell them that they must just go for a walk. Something else that some teachers do, I don't know if you've ever seen that aroma clay. So some teachers have the aroma clay in their class, a few jars, and then in the morning they let the kids choose one and they can smell it. You must just be aware of the smell, get themselves grounded, ready for the day or ready for the lesson. You continue with your curriculum. I think the biggest thing is we need to think about their lives, what inspires them. So something that you can also do is you can do a visualization activity with them where they need to think about their life. What is their purpose? What are they working towards? That's also a very, very good mindfulness technique. But like I said, there's lots of different activities that you can do. And we must remember it doesn't have to take a whole lesson. It can just take a minute or two. And I think that's part of the conversation is I hope that some of you will go back to the schools where you are and just speak to them about how can you make a difference, even if it's not in life skills, even if it's just for a minute or two before the lesson starts. The last point there is personal connections. How do we have personal connections? We need to let them speak. We need to let them discuss. We need to let them share their feelings. That is what's very, very important. We have shared in the chat box some wonderful links in terms of applications for children. These are 3 applications which are so wonderful that you can actually give to the kids. They can do it at home. It also helps. So social emotional learning doesn't only have to happen at school. It can happen at home as well. And they can put these applications on. If your school has the resources, you can also use it there. The one is the Wheel of Emotions. It helps students identify their feelings within the 8 primary emotions. So joy, sadness, acceptance, disgust, fear, anger, surprise, and anticipation. So remember, with social emotional learning and inclusivity, it's very important that kids are aware of their emotions. So they need to be able to identify it. Often when I ask a child, how do you feel? They might say, I don't know. They'll just say sad, but to what level of sadness are they? To what level of fear are they? What level of anger are they? That's what we need to do. And besides this app that you can obviously get on any smart device, you can also print a wheel of emotions that you can keep in your classroom, where it shows you the different colors, which I think is it's a lovely tool where children can just be aware. Then the mood meter is another application which I think is lovely, which can build their emotional vocabulary. So just how they can actually speak about emotions. They can also, on the application, say, for example, today I feel angry at a level of a 10. And then the next day, today I'm angry at a level of a 1. Just so that they can scaffold how they feel. And also what's important is it gives ideas on how to regulate their emotions. So it actually helps them in terms of skills. So if they know they're angry, they can click on the button and then they can just get some ideas on how to regulate their emotions there. Other one that I wanted to share is Sown to Grow. That's a goal setting platform. Remember, SEL, it's all about setting goals. It's all about helping them track their progress, write reflections. So even just doing something simple as at the beginning of next term, reflect on last term. What went well, what didn't go well. It's a social emotional learning tool. And it is a sense of inclusivity, learning from each other. So I just want to leave you with, always remember that we need to be kind. We have to have kind conversations. We need to be careful with the language that we use. We have to make sure that we don't just go according to one story. Remember that we all have different stories. And you know what's so wonderful about South Africa and where we stay is we love storytelling. I think, if we can sit around a fire and we can tell stories, it's such a lovely thing. So we must remember we have to be kind. Be kind with your language. Be thinking how you speak in your class, because words matter a lot in terms of the class. I said here, co-create shared expectations. When you are in your class, I think it's very important that all of the learners agree. What are their expectations? What do you as a teacher expect? What do they expect? And through that, you're actually going to build a relationship. You're going to show them what responsible decision making is. You're going to make them aware. Another simple activity that you can use in class, social emotional learning, is a movement break. Let them all jump up and dance. Let them all jump up and shake each other's hand. Let them all jump up or just turn to each other and say, this is how I'm feeling. As simple as that. It just gets their mind off a little bit and it brings them back to the fact that they are a person, they have feelings, and it's important that they share. End of a lesson all day, have an optimistic closure. Which 1 or 2 words sum up our time together? That's also going to guide you in terms of what they've taken from your lesson. What is it that they remember? What do they appreciate? And of course, then one of the biggest things that is so important in terms of SEL is gratitude practice. So at the end of the day, at the end of a lesson, acknowledge something or someone. What are you grateful for? Again, that fosters empathy, growth, builds responsible decision making, builds relationships. And these are just some ideas that I have today in terms of just how to implement it in your classroom. I really hope that it's been helpful. And like I said, I want to leave you with that thought. Do not have a single story. You have to remember people have lots of stories and we need to look at all the different sides. Thank you so much.
Thank you to our wonderful speakers for sharing such insightful and I think very valuable information. We have a couple of questions coming through. Okay, I see one for Charlene. The question reads, in terms of social emotional learning, how do we as educators navigate the emotional psychological problems of our learners without curriculum suffering? Thank you.
Okay, so just to answer that, I think the biggest thing is just how you go back to your school and how you address the overall feeling that the school has in terms of social emotional learning. Something that's very powerful is if, and there are schools that do this, where you have a morning that's just focused on emotional and psychological problems. So it's almost like a workshop for them where they just work on something that's gone wrong. So maybe if it was a bullying incident or you want to speak about diversity or anything like that, to have people come in, do a workshop, that's probably one of the greatest ways. And then also with regards to emotional and psychological problems is use the people that are there. If you have the support of a counselor, if you don't, to refer them so that the educational psychologists can get involved from the department to assist. I think that's probably one of the best ways to go about it without letting the curriculum suffer.
Thank you so much for sharing, Charlene. We have another question here for Prof. Cina. The question reads, what would be the role and the duty of educators when they notice that a learner might be experiencing learning difficulties and they are really struggling academically? However, the learner had not been diagnosed with a learning difficulty. Thank you, Prof.
Thank you. I think in that question, there's also an answer. The answer is implied in the sense that the person who's asking the question says the learner has not been diagnosed with learning difficulties or a learning disability. Very often in schools, we run into the danger of assuming that learners have a learning disability or a learning difficulty. There's a difference between the two. I think Charlene can explain that better as a psychologist. So one of the things that probably we didn't talk about are the policies or the tools in place that help teachers to navigate some of these things. One of the policies that really is very useful, and especially if one understands how it operates, is a policy of SIAS, screening, identification, assessment, and support. It makes it very clear what processes teachers have to follow when they suspect, for example, that a learner has, it's not even that when a learner has a difficulty, a learner has a difficulty. So you suspect a disability, but a difficulty is there. So I wonder to what extent schools have school-based support teams, which are actually the channel through which some of these difficulties can be presented. So my question to the person who's asking the question is, does your school have an SPST where you can present some of this? Because a team approach is always quite useful in terms of how you navigate these issues, especially when as a teacher you've already failed, not succeeded on your own. So do share the difficulties with some of your team members. It could be the FACE or the grade teachers, or even present it within the SPST, team. So do check CS for those ideas. I'm not sure whether I've answered the question to the the desire of the one who was asking it. It might really be scratching the surface, I know.
Thank you, Prof. We have another question here for you. Simon says, what is the practicality of SEL in school settings that are skewed towards syllabus completion? Thank you.
I know that when we teach teachers, we talk about different approaches to teaching. One of those is integration. So Simon, you might not find space. Maybe let's say you teach mathematics. You might not find space like somebody who teaches life skills or life orientation to teach, SEL. However, my suggestion would be that as you teach that mathematics, think of the ideas that Charlene has given us. How are you going to inject those ideas into mathematics? Teaching mathematics with the heart, so that, you also promote compassion amongst your learners, the ability to share, being compassionate to those who are not able. We know that learners come with different assets within a school setting. So do find space through which you can integrate some of those ideas, even as you teach mathematics or whatever subject you are teaching. Charlene, maybe Charlene could add something to that.
Yes, Simon, like I said, I think maths is maths, and yes, I do understand that it is a rigid curriculum, and you're stressed, you want to get through all the work and make sure that everything is done. But having a strategy, just like, you know what, how do you feel about this sum? Does it make you frustrated? Does it make you anxious? How do you feel about this section of work? It just allows that little bit of emotional awareness. You know what? A lot of us in the class are anxious about this section. We can't do algebra, we can't do trigonometry. Then they're going to understand that it's not them, it's just them. Because what might happen in a maths class is there's that one kid that sits and they think they are the only one that struggles. And that just helps them to just be aware that, you know what, I'm not alone. And I think that's one of the tools that I possibly would use. With regards to your other question, Simon, where you said what inclusion strategies can teachers use to cater to the needs of extra intelligent learners, I think what's important there is that you go to them and you give them extra additional work, especially with regards to math. Like if you can give them an extra tool, an extra worksheet or something like that to help them, that can make sure that you also cater towards them. I hope that helps in terms of an answer there.
Maybe I could add to that, Charlene, about learners who are gifted. We always talk about the strategy of differentiation, that in terms of, you teach from the same outcomes as far as the curriculum is concerned, but then you make whatever you're going to teach in that particular time slightly more complex for those gifted learners. For example, I might be teaching English today. I might be talking about, verbs and tenses, etc. But there's that particular learner to whom it's not just about English as a subject, but language is a difficulty. So how am I going to approach that, helping them to acquire language skills through teaching, for example, verbs or tenses, etc. So that the strategy of differentiation always helps a lot. And it's a pity, this is just a 1-hour webinar. We could talk about issues of universal design for learning. How do you plan lessons in such a manner that you think about all the assets and the challenges that come into your classroom? What are different ways in which you can do that as a teacher? So Simon, that's a topic for another day because it doesn't fit within the time that we have at the moment. But you can do some reading on differentiation, some reading on universal design for learning. I know it will give you, whatever reading you do, it will give you very broad answers in terms of that. But then you can always fine-tune them in terms of what subject you teach and what the implications there are.
Thank you so much. I think we have about 2 more minutes left. Let's see if we can get one more question for you. We've got a couple of nice comments that are coming through. Karina says, inclusivity really needs the whole school to be involved, and building a school culture is so important.
That is true.
Okay.
Danica, I just want to answer Farhana's Khan's question.
Sure.
She said here, how can teachers accommodate learners with mild speech and hearing difficulties in a mainstream class? I think it's a difficult one because I do know that schools are full of learners that have difficulties and they're not maybe in the right school. So definitely the SICE document is important to fill in so that we can make sure that they are in the correct school. But if it's a mild hearing difficulty, I think the probably the most best way to go about it is definitely to make sure that that child is seated in the front of the class. To also make sure that they can repeat instructions so that you go to the child and you make sure that they have an understanding of what the instruction is. Let them repeat it back to you. And then also the other way to go about that is to give them something printed so that if they can't hear, at least they can see the instruction in front of them. With regards to speech, I think there again, you must just make sure that you have clarity when they speak. Do you understand what they're trying to say? And if you can't, let them repeat it. And if it is a struggle, let them stay after class so you can make sure that you've understood them. I think that's probably the best way to go about it. Also, having activities that's more written, where you can go around and you can look at the things that the students write that maybe have speech difficulties. Those are just some ideas that I can think of now.
Thank you so much, Prof. Cina and Charlene. We have come to the end of our live Q&A session. But if we did not answer any of your questions, or you'd like one of our team members or one of the speakers with us today to get back to you, please leave your email address and query in the chat box, and we'll try to get back to you as soon as possible. Please do follow us on our various social media platforms to stay up to date on upcoming events and program launches, as well as updates. We will keep you updated to see the recording of this webinar and when it will be uploaded onto our YouTube channel. Thank you once again to our attendees and our wonderful speakers for joining us this morning, and we hope you have a wonderful day further.